Good afternoon, listeners and readers of the South Florida Tribune. Today we have something a little different for you today. I'm here with Scott Morganroth, who I do on Tuesdays and Thursdays host the Sports Exchange with, where we talk to numerous personalities in the sports media world. But again, like I prefaced earlier, we have something a little bit different for you today. The biggest thing that we're trying to preach here is versatility. We don't want to just talk about sports, so what are we going to talk about today in the beginning of a new show, which I will be the commander-in-chief of, is music. Other than sports, music is a passion of mine, something I've been very passionate about ever since I was a little kid, something I've gravitated toward ever since, I was a wee little toddler sitting in the back seat of my dad's car, with the songs playing on the radio, and just kind of, as I get older and maturing, further discovering other music that suits my taste, my moods. And today, for about 30 to 45 minutes, me and Scott are going to talk a little bit about our musical journey. One journey has logged a lot more miles than another's, but it's always fun to hear people's perspective on music that they grew up with and, whether they still listen to it today and if it still seems to resonate with them. So, Scott, as we get started, I want to ask you, I know you're a big sports guy, as I am. You're probably, you're more well-versed in other sports than I am. Me, primarily, I'm baseball, football, with a little bit of basketball in there, whereas you're kind of the everything man with all these other sports. But I wanted to ask you, because this is another expertise for me, what is your relationship with music like? Take me back to a little bit when you were a kid, as far as the first time you discovered music and, how you kind of progressed with it moving forward.
Well, I've always been one of those individuals that likes the soft, easy-going, soft rock type of music. I could sit here and tell you all the artists I like, but we wouldn't have enough time in this program. But anything that gets me to relax, which is never easy in the first place, okay, it's something that I like. I don't need anything that's the major hard-nosed rock and roll or anything that stuff. I, myself, at my age, call it first-class noise, okay? But that's me. That doesn't mean that there are other people that view that type of music differently. One of the things, my relationship with music is actually being able to take longer drives, and I have a strong feel for meditation, whether I'm taking a 5-hour drive, whether I'm driving 24 hours, whether I'm driving all over the place. It doesn't matter whether, and what nice thing we have in Florida, Louis, is the ability to drive up the ocean. Because some of my deepest inner thoughts are done on those types of drives. So it depends on what I'm into.
So are there any artists in particular that you'd want to mention that you'd like to listen to on those drives? Because I have one that springs to mind that I'll further delve into after I hear you.
How much time you got?
Just give me a couple of artists that you like to hear.
I'll tell you right now, Chicago, REO Speedwagon. When I was younger, I used to like Barry Manilow, Olivia, Maureen McGovern. Olivia Newton-John was always good. Just to name a few, Bette Midler. The list goes on and on. Mm-hmm. Chicago, Journey.
Chicago, yeah, very great. Influential. A lot of people tend to give them a lot of disrespect because if you listen to their late 60s output, which I really find is very underrated, because their debut record, when they were still known as the Chicago Transit Authority, they did get their name, in fact, because members do hail from that part of the country. They're from Chicago, Illinois. They were originally called the Chicago Transit Authority, and what's very cool about them is they were the first band, or not the first band, but they were the first wave of a group of bands that were part of this style of music that we like to refer to as jazz fusion. Now, I don't know if you've delved deep into the world of jazz, but the likes of Miles Davis, who is almost like a chameleon the way that David Bowie was in rock music sense, where he tended to embrace a lot of varying forms of music. Like if you listen to Miles Davis in 1956, when he's doing a lot of his, which would be considered his cool jazz period, he's doing a lot of very modal kind of New York City kind of subway kind of stuff, very passy. Or then you go to 1959 when he's got, an absolute, which if there's one album I'd recommend to you from this, and listeners too, it's Kind of Blue, Miles Davis's 1959, one of his many magnum opuses, because it is a gold standard in pretty much jazz music. It is the greatest selling jazz record of all time, and I am going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but you have John Coltrane on saxophone, you got Cannonball Adderley on drums, Bill Evans on piano. If you like very soft music, Bill Evans' debut album is a fantastic release as far as jazz piano playing is concerned. A lot of those jazz records that came out at the time are great. But what I'm trying to get to with Davis is that he would, as the 60s would go on, and especially the year after he put out Kind of Blue, he put out a record called Sketches of Spain, which is a fantastic record if you haven't checked out, because he's embracing a lot of forms of bolero music and other forms of authentic Spanish music. Like a lot of the percussion on Sketches of Spain is very much indicative of that, of something you'd hear in a lot of Mexican or like Spanish music of the time. I mean, it's a fantastic record. I highly suggest that anybody who's listening, and even you, Scott, you listen to it. But Davis would tend to evolve, and around the time that Chicago gets started, Miles Davis, I believe this is either 67 or 68, he puts out a record called The Silent Mood. And this is a lot different from what he was doing in the late 50s and early 60s when he's doing Porgy and Bess, which is just a rendition of Gershwin's songs done in his very jazz-like kind of way, very modal third stream kind of jazz is what they would refer to it as. But he would put out a record in 68, I believe, called The Silent Way, and Silent Way is really the first immersion we see of jazz music and electronics, so you hear a lot of very almost like ambient, like keyboards, ambient, a very kind of like meditative form of music that would develop as the early 1970s would progress with artists like Brian Eno and kraut rock bands like Cluster and Noi. I mean, I'm talking about some very left field kind of stuff here, but Davis would soon progress after Silent Way. You know, he's getting more meditative. He's getting away from this very blue collar kind of jazz music to this, his magnum opus, other than Kind of Blue in 59, is the 1970 release called Bitches Brew. And Bitches Brew, for those who haven't heard, it's something that if Chicago, which I'm sure, members of Chicago heard, probably, Terry Kath, a famed Chicago guitar player, I'm sure had probably listened to it a myriad of times when they were recording singles like 25 or 6 to 4 in early 1970. Kind of ushered in this revolution of what Chicago did in the late 60s and would go on to do in the early to mid-70s is what we refer to as jazz fusion. And jazz fusion, what jazz fusion really is, it spawns from the realms of rock music to, jazz music, and it incorporates a lot of elements of rock instrumentation. So, for example, on Bitches Brew, again, a fantastic Miles Davis record, if I haven't already said so myself. You have John McLaughlin on guitar, who John McLaughlin is considered one of the premier jazz fusion guitar players. He also did a record in the early 70s with Carlos Santana, who we know, if you ever listen to early Santana records, and it's funny, you said you're a big fan of Journey. Greg Rowley, the founder of Journey, was the keyboard player in the original Santana in the early 70s and late 60s. Miles Davis would begin to expand his repertoire and would work in these influences. I'll never forget when he saw Jimi Hendrix and bands like Cream, these very blues-based psychedelic rock bands in the late 60s outselling him. He went to Clive Davis, I believe the head of Columbia Records at the time, and he asked why he wasn't selling the way he did, that like the aforementioned acts I mentioned do. And Davis, he was like, you know what, I have to conform to the times and I have to evolve, and he did. And it's very, you may not see the Chicago connection with Miles Davis, but embracing realms of rock music and jazz and kind of coming out with your own very unique style, which Chicago would tend to regress to more of an adult contemporary sound. Like if you listen to 1977's If You Leave Me Now, very great single, but at the same time, it's them very much conforming to the era in which they're in, where, they're just trying to get on top 40 radio, trying to get Casey Kasem to play him on the radio. And yeah, I mean, Chicago, a great act that I probably spent a little bit too much time talking about, but, you mentioned REO Speedwagon, another great AOR band, which is very album-oriented rock band from the 70s, wrote a lot of big singles. Obviously, they got their big break in the 80s, but you did mention earlier that you do like to drive down the beach and listen to music, and we have that benefit when it comes to Florida because, we live along the coast. And if there's one act I want to mention and I really want to get your take on it, it's an act that I adore. It's the Beach Boys. Before I get really wordy with it, what is your relationship with the Beach Boys? If you have any, have you heard any of their music over the years? And are there any songs in particular that you may enjoy?
I mean, for me to isolate certain songs would be difficult. But yeah, I'm very familiar with the Beach Boys. I think they're fine. They fit my genre, as you people like to say in the music business.
Now, it's funny, though. I mean, a lot of people tend to associate the Beach Boys, and as I do myself, I can't help but whenever I'm going down to the beach, and I know it's very trite to say, but the early Beach Boys, and that's 1961 to 63, when they were still recording standards in the realm of, say, like 50s doo-wop and Brian Wilson's love for Gershwin and vocal harmony groups like the Four Freshmen. I do associate the Beach Boys with surfing culture, even though, funny enough, only one of the Beach Boys were surfers. That was the drummer, Dennis Wilson. But I'm sure you don't know this, and some listeners may, but one thing I adore about the Beach Boys is, Brian Wilson is the figurehead in the Beach Boys story. Brian Wilson, and we're not talking about, for all you sports owners, we're not talking about the closer for the San Francisco Giants who won the World Series for them in 2010. But we're talking about Brian Wilson, the bass player, the keyboard player, and the producer, pretty much the anchor of what made the Beach Boys special. And if there's anything I'd like to impart on this podcast and when I talk to people about music is that you really need to see the bigger picture and delve deeper into artists that you haven't really listened to or you have some memory of and you have some kind of past relationship with, whether it's a couple of songs. But look at a lot of the Beach Boys stuff from a perspective of innovation. I'm sure you probably heard a song like I Get Around growing up, right?
I don't know about that.
But you probably have like Fun or Surfin' USA. Like these are very
Surfin' USA. Now you're on the side.
That's an early Beach Boys hit. That's from 1963. That's from the records from the record of the same name. But if you start to, what's great about the Beach Boys is there's a trajectory, and it does tend to climax, and then it goes downhill because Brian Wilson did have struggles with drugs and mental illness. He is actually a sufferer of schizoaffective disorder, which is very sad. But listen to a Beach Boys record from, I would start with the record Summer Days and Summer Nights, which comes out, or not Summer Days and Summer Nights, I'm sorry, but the same year, 1965, we have a record called Beach Boys Today, which comes out, and it's an absolutely phenomenal record, and it's Brian Wilson, who at this point, he's very heavily into the realm of drugs. If most don't know, Brian Wilson, the touring bass player, head songwriter along with Mike Love, who was a bass vocalist for the Beach Boys. Brian Wilson has a nervous breakdown on a plane flight to Texas in 1964, and he ends up coming to the conclusion that he can't tour anymore. So what does he do? He tells the boys, and they go out touring with an artist I'm sure you've heard of, Glenn Campbell, who Glenn Campbell was a very big protege of the Beach Boys. He actually plays on a lot of their releases from 1964 onward to about 1967. And Brian says, I'm going to stay home and I'm going to record. And he wrote songs for them and he produced arrangements. And a lot of the Beach Boys stuff during this period and moving forward tends to feature a lot of session musicians. I'm sure you've heard a song, Scott, called Be My Baby by the Ronettes. You have to. I'm sure as soon as you...
I don't know. Maybe the words. I don't know.
As soon as you hear...
For me to start to go out there and tell you that I can recognize words, Louis, would be like me telling you that even though I've seen a person a million times, I remember names. Not always the case. You'll find out as you get older. But yeah, if I heard the words, the lyrics, I probably might. As
soon as you hear a song like that, though, Be My Baby, which is produced by Phil Spector, and if most of you don't know who Phil Spector is, he's a very famous LA producer. He worked with a myriad of session musicians known as the Wrecking Crew. And what Phil Spector did was he was known for this technique called the Wall of Sound. The Wall of Sound is a very innovative production style. He would go on to employ it when he did the final mixes of the Beach Boys, the Beatles' final record, Let It Be, released in 1970, though not the final recorded Beatles record, but I'm getting off on the point I'm trying to make. Brian Wilson would soon to become obsessed with this particular song, and the production styles of Phil Spector would soon begin to employ a lot of musicians from Phil Spector's Wrecking Crew, particularly drummer Hal Blaine and bass player / guitar player Carol Kay. They were prominent members of some of the Beach Boys' most innovative works. And so if you listen to a song like, say, Please Let Me Wonder, which is an absolutely gem of a Beach Boys song off Beach Boys Today, you'll see that a lot of the early surf sounds of early Beach Boys records, particularly Carl Wilson and early Beach Boy member David Mark's guitar styles, have been eschewed out for more of a subtle, very orchestral sound because he is using the likes of Glenn Campbell, who was at that time was a member of Phil Spector's Wrecking Crew. He was a guitar player / bass player, and but Beach Boys. The Beach Boys would progress millions of miles ahead of where they were in 1963, and I think that's one of the beautiful things about music is, especially back in those days, they didn't really have as much time. There was a myriad of deadlines you had to meet. You had to have essentially a record out a year, maybe sometimes 2 records out a year and a slew of singles. And Brian Wilson's mental breakdown in part was facilitated by the fact that he was constantly working. I mean, I believe in 1963 the Beach Boys put out 3 albums alone, and I believe 2 in 64 and 3 in 65. One, Beach Boys Party, isn't much of a record. It's more just like a group gathering in the studio to record cover songs. There's a couple of Beatles covers on there. Jan and Dean, another surf rock group from the 60s. Dean Torrance, I believe, helped sing on one of those songs. But Wilson, realizes that they can't be held down by a record label, and they were signed to Capitol Records at the time. So with the implementation of his interest in Phil Spector's wall of sound recordings, the fact that he is experimenting with drugs at this time as a means of, and it's a very 60s trite kind of cliche, it's expanding your mind through the use of drugs. And he was, smoking marijuana habitually at the time. He said he began to hear things in music that he hadn't before. And the great thing about Brian Wilson is he did all of this despite the